Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace and blessings of Allah be upon you all. Continuing with our series of Your Muslim Neighbors, and we are continuing in the chapter in the Arabic known as Al-Ma'idah, basically the feast or the repast. Given that name, by the way, which alludes to the event which is known in the biblical tradition as the Last Supper, which is also mentioned in the end of the surah. Perhaps at a future time we'll also mention that. In our last episode, we visited the story of the first murder of Cain, his brother Abel, and the consequence of that, and the fact that the children of Israel also were given this instruction and were given this maxim, that these two maxims, if you will, that to give life, or to take, first of all, to take one life is like to take the life of humanity totally, and to preserve and save the life of one is akin to preserving and saving the life of the entirety of humanity. So all of the legal systems of religion, and after all, morality, ethics, the actual most equitable legal systems that man has known they all spring from, if not directly, instructed through religious teachings. It's through religion that we have morals, we have ethics, not, as I mentioned a few episodes ago, otherwise ethics, morals become merely subjective according to my expediency. Whatever we feel is expedient for, fulfilling our objectives and objectives of life will make our ethics and morals, subjugated to that, rather than subjugating our objectives and our behavior to morals and ethics, which are static and are, continuous and unchangeable. And this is what religion gives us. One of the, key takeaways from religion, once we believe in the Creator, then we believe in His revelation. This revelation is going to give us morals and ethics that are going to mold our individual and collective lives in a beautiful way, and live in the best possible way that humans can possibly live, and end up with the best possible circumstances in the life hereafter. If we don't have this concept, we don't have that belief set, and we don't have those divine morals and ethics, then it's all just, whatever I feel. I think, I feel, and there's nothing worse than, 8 billion people on the planet, each one with my I think and I feel. So we'll have, 8 billion, we have potentially 8 billion different codes of ethics and morals, a mess, to say the least. So religion didn't leave us, particularly in these very critical issues, to subjectively and wantonly come up with whatever we wish, but rather give us specific, static, and constant directives that are going to guide humanity throughout their existence. One of those injunctions is the injunctions that deals with intoxicants. And it's well known by probably most of the people in the world that Muslims are not supposed to take alcohol. What is probably not known is that alcohol has not been looked favorably upon by any tradition. And intoxication is not something which has been, given a pat on the back, if you will, at any time in human history among ethical and moral people. And apparently also there are biblical indications that, in the taking of these strong drinks, which affect, the mind, and is going to loosen the morals and ethics, it's obviously not something a God-fearing person is going to engage in, should not engage in. And so the prohibition of alcoholic beverages, and the same injunction takes place with any substance which is going to, impact and alter the state of mind drastically, so that it becomes irrational and it becomes incapable of continuing, with the type of morality and the type of ethics that he's been ordered to do. And this is exactly what particularly alcohol does. It loosens up one's cognitive powers and also the hold on one's moral self. And of course, we find people, so I couldn't help it, I was drunk. Well, why do, I did this under the influence, So to eliminate that influence altogether seems to be the most prudent course of action. And this is, in fact, exactly the course of action in Islam. It's also to be mentioned that wine, by the way, particularly wine, and the wine of the Arabs was made from dates and from grapes as well. Dates were more prominent than grapes. And so their intoxicants, their alcoholic beverages were mostly from dates, fermented dates. And it was so prevalent in Arab society that they had, throughout the day, like we begin our day generally here in America with a cup of coffee. Well, they would start their day with wine, date wine. And throughout the day, they would have different names for the different, segments of the day and the name of the drink of that particular time. I mean, it was like, the early wake up coffee and the mid-noon, midday coffee. And so, people are really into coffee 4 or 5 times a day. Well, similarly was drink. It was like water. And so very few people were not involved in drinking. By the way, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, was never involved in drinking. He was never involved in any of these atrocities. And it never appealed to him at all. He was always repulsed by these kinds of behaviors. Nevertheless, it was prevalent in most of the society. Very few people abstained. Also, Abu Bakr, his very close friend, his closest friend, before Islam and after, also was of the same nature. He was repulsed by all of these kind of things, and drinking as well. He never drank. So here we have the prohibition. We're going to mention the very verses which prohibit. And a few years ago, we mentioned also, and we're going to further elucidate on that and actually read these verses. And we want to mention here the method of divine legislation. And we've talked about this from time to time. And the very fact that divine legislation is divine. And so since it's connected to legislation, divine legislation is connecting human beings to divine legislation, to connect them with the divine. It's not simply to regulate their behavior just for the sake of it, but rather regulate their behavior so that it connects them, number one, as being more acceptable human beings in the eyes of their creator, and obviously to be better human beings and better creation one with another. And all of these injunctions, bring about a better society as well. And similarly is the injunction of the prohibition of alcohol and intoxicants. However, on the one hand, we've mentioned from time to time that the legislation, divine rules and regulations, and the more difficult they are, the more the preparation would be undertaken to prepare the minds and the hearts to accept that legislature. And salient, one of the most prolific, in fact, examples of that is the prohibition of alcohol. And we're going to draw a parallel very soon between the prohibition Islamically and un-Islamically. So, as all the other, injunctions of the Quran, they are preceded and succeeded by motivational, discourse, reminding human beings of their purpose on earth, reminding them of the favors of being created by a creator who has given them everything and has sent them a religion and prophets and scripture for their betterment, for their purification. And those who follow it, they will be rewarded unimaginably in hereafter, forever, for eternally. And those who disobey, they will face a very severe chastisement. And so, on the one hand, the motivation, that always accompanies these things, and also what we say, or what we call in the Arabic language, tadrij bit-tashri', or the incremental, nature of legislation, rather than bringing about a law at one point when a law was not present, and now implementing that law from day one, from hour one, from moment one, this is incongruent with human nature, because humans are not going to, if you don't prepare them, for a particular order, just as a good parent will, he will prepare his children, to accept the responsibility of adulthood. He just doesn't wait until they enter into adulthood and throw him into it. He needs to be prepared for it. So similarly, there's a kind of adulthood in accepting these, the furthering, our morality and our ethics. And so seeing that people have, very vile, vile habits, which perhaps they've been doing throughout their lives, to expect them to stop that and change it from day one is expectation that most humans, it would be ill-placed, put it lightly. You can't expect people, in one go to totally change their behavior. So we find in the prohibition of alcohol, we don't find the first injunction being a outright prohibition. We find 4 stages. And being that alcohol is now part and parcel of Arabic life, so it's going to take some time. And there was no mention of this whatsoever in Makkah, other than alluding to the concept that intoxicants may not be the greatest thing. And so the ayat that first perhaps alludes to the difference between the clear and pure and beneficial substance which is extracted from dates and from grapes, as opposed to sakaran, meaning the intoxicants. And in that context, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمِن ثَمَرَاتِ النَّخِيلِ وَالْأَعْنَابِ تَتَّخِذُونَ سَخْرًا وَرِزْقًا حَسَنًا. And mentioning the favors of God, God mentions, you see that among his favors is that he sends down to you the fruits of the palm and the grape, the fruits of the palm tree and the grapevines, from which you take intoxicants and a pure sustenance. So here we don't have actually a statement that these are, a prohibited things, and that they are, not legal, but there is a comparison here. On the one hand, you make from these 2 elements, you make an intoxicant, and on the other hand, you make a good and beneficial sustenance, or sustenance. So it alludes that rather than being good and pure, this is not good and pure. It's an intoxicant, and so it's not good and pure. Perhaps, if that being the case, and in fact, some of the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, they took this to infer that maybe this is not a great thing to be involved in. It doesn't seem to be good and pure, and we want to live good and pure lives, so they left it. However, there is no mention that you need to leave it. It's prohibited, even that it's an abomination. It just says that on the one hand, you take some good, pure drink, and then you have this intoxicants, which may infer, and definitely does, that it's not good and pure, and it's not a great thing to be involved in. Okay. Then after that, a more specific injunction comes down. And, and still, they, most of them, very few have taken that prompting, from that first verse that I mentioned. And it remains, embedded in their society. And even after they migrate to Medina, it continues. So the next injunction that comes down, they start asking about wine, gambling, and things of this nature, even though legislation has not been sent down prohibiting the same. So they ask about this. So the reply from God at this point, from the Quran itself, says, فِيهِمَا إِثْمٌ كَبِيرٌ وَمَنَافِعُ لِلنَّاسِ. So God replies to them saying that there is great sin. However, there's also benefits that people derive out of that. Whatever perceived benefits, probably the most perceived benefit is that they make it, they sell it, and there's revenue generation. They might come up with other things, keeps you warm in the winter, this and that, whatever. But nevertheless, there is a great sin. Still, it's not prohibited. At this point, many more understand, there's a great sin involved, then we shouldn't be engaged in it. Then they leave it. The next incident is that the time of prayer took place, and some of the companions, being a bit, a bit spiced, as it were, they had been drinking, and so when they read the prayers, and when they read, one is the Imam, and he leads the prayers, and he reads from the Quran, and he read the surah which says, "Oh, you who disbelieve, we do not, we believe in what you do not believe, and we do not, disbelieve in what you believe in," and so forth and so on. So rather than saying that we do not worship that which you worship, so being in a kind of an intoxicated state, he says, we worship what you worship. And so obviously inadvertently, he doesn't mean to say that we worship what you don't worship, but he made this blunder because of the fact that he's intoxicated. Realizing the blunder, at the same time, Allah sends down the verse saying, prohibiting the companions, the Muslims, from attending prayers while they're in the state of intoxication. They have to wait until they're sober, right? Until ta'lamuna ma taqulun, what you're saying, until you understand what you're saying, no. But still, nevertheless, the final prohibition has not taken place yet. So now the prohibition stands that at time of prayer, no drinking, no intoxication. And so many of them continued with that. Many of them, understood that, well, if we need to leave it, let's leave it altogether. But still, many of them, perhaps the majority, continued. They would just be careful not to be drunk when it was time for prayers. Ultimately, the final prohibition comes in this very ayat that we're going to read, and some of the ramifications of that ayat and other issues also that were prohibited along with it. And we're going to enter into that just after this short break. So stay tuned. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. So we're continuing with the discussion of the prohibition of intoxicants, alcoholic beverages, etc. And so we mentioned earlier about the fact that the divine rules and regulations, legislation, and that is in fact what is Sharia. And as we mentioned many times, that Sharia is not just the punitive measures, for a few major sins, but rather the way in which a Muslim lives. Every aspect of his life, there is guidance, there's rules and regulations, there's etiquettes, there's, inwardly and outwardly. And that is what Sharia is, this wide path where we are supposed to tread, which guides us in all the affairs of our life. So here we're talking about the prohibition of wine. And we mentioned that those prohibitions were accompanied by motivation beforehand and thereafter. As we said, the divine revelations are always sent like that, reminding, human beings of their responsibility and the, encouraging them towards seeking God's pleasure and hoping for his reward and fearing his displeasure and punishment. And at the same time, these difficult injunctions came piecemeal. The prohibition did not come down one time, stop now, cease and desist at this moment, but rather incrementally, as a suggestion, and then a light prohibition, and then ultimately culminating in a total prohibition. And after all, since this Quran is the last revelation of God, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last prophet of God. This nation who follows, the Muslim nation, is the last nation that has been sent out for the benefit of mankind. We cannot be, engaged in drunken stupor and, squandering away our high position and, squandering away our objective, to be those who submit to the religion of God and be examples and promote this among, the rest of humanity. So it's not just like a person on his job, it's prohibited for him to be intoxicated. He'll lose his job, even though they may not, after work, perhaps they engage. But when you're on your job, that's across the board. Nobody allows intoxication. So we Muslims are on our job, supposed to be on our job 7/24/365. So there's no room for this kind of behavior and this kind of activity. So in this context, the revelation comes down, the final and thorough prohibition of intoxicants and other, abominable acts. And so I'll read as our habit is, I'll read the Arabic and I'll translate and elucidate, inshallah ta'ala. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا إنما الخمر والميسر والأنصاب والأزلام رجس من عمل الشيطان فاجتنبوه لعلكم تفلحون إنما يريد الشيطان أن يوقع بينكم العداوة والبغضاء في الخمر والميسر ويصدكم عن ذكر الله وعن الصلاة فهل أنتم منتهون. So here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says something basically, oh you who believe, and again we've mentioned this many times, when these injunctions come down, they're generally this first motivational sort of encouragement, oh people of belief, if you are the people of belief, this is a very important message, take heed, it's for your rectification, it's for your benefit. Oh you people of Iman, the people of faith, verily, is intoxicant. Khamar is basically the name of wine. So wine, khamar, and it's called khamar, yukhamidul aql. It's called khamar because it not only it ferments in itself, it ferments your brain as well, and actually physically. And those who have studied biology, they know that. Even a small amount is quite detrimental to the human brain, and let alone all the rest of his behavior and etc. So verily intoxicants, alcohol, alcoholic beverages, maisir, gambling, amazing, gambling, squandering your money and squandering your time, in which, what is the outcome of that? Generally, it's financial loss, enmity, and as God says here, as he's going to say, quite soon, it spreads this animosity, and sometimes it ends up with taking of lives. As you've probably seen, Hollywood depicts the poker game, the classical poker game, what ends up with the smoking guns. What prompted that? Maisar, gambling. So we don't need to be engaged in that. So intoxicants, gambling, al-ansab, that was the statues and the idols that they had, set up, there in Makkah around the Kaaba, and what man has done from time to time, and still does in certain regions of the world. Azlam are the divining arrows. These was a kind of sort of soothsaying or fortune telling. They had these arrows and these sort of sticks that they would have things written on them, and they would throw them or draw them, and then they would come to a conclusion that what course of action would be taken based on what straw was driven. So these are all divining and soothsaying, fortune telling. All this kind of behavior is not suitable for a person who's devoted his life for the service of God and living a godly lifestyle, living a life of Islam, basically. So these are all rijsun min amalish. These are all filthy behaviors which are prompted by Satan. Fajtanibuhu la'allakum tuflihun. So in your best interest, leave them, cease and desist, la'allakum, so that perhaps you will succeed in this world and in the next world. إِنَّمَا يُرِيدُ الشَّيْطَانَ أَنْ يُوقِعَ بَيْنَكُمُ الْعَدَاوَةَ وَالْبَغْضَاءَ. Satan merely wants, through the medium of these things, particularly alcohol and gambling and these other things, but particularly the main focus here is intoxicants, and we all know that, and it's daily on the news. He wants to spread animosity, enmity, and hatred, which ultimately culminates in disaster. Fil khamri wal maisir, and here particularly he mentions, in intoxicants and in gambling, وَيَصُدُّكُمْ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ, and prevent you from your main purpose of existence, which is to remember Allah. Remember and engage in the remembrance of Allah. And the greatest remembrance is to obey His commandments, live a life that He's going to be pleased with. وَعَنِ الصَّلَاةِ, remembrance in general and prayers particularly. This is, the ultimate aim of Satan in, prompting people to use these things. Allahu Akbar. So, فَهَلْ أَنْتُمْ مُنْتَهُونَ? So are you going to leave this? Have you been able to understand the concept here? So are you going to leave this? It's going to be in your betterment. Allah doesn't need, our obedience, and it's not going to harm him, our disobedience. وَأَطِيعُوا اللَّهَ وَأَطِيعُوا الرَّسُولَ, and obey Allah and obey His Rasul. وَاحْذَرُوا, and be on guard, beware. فِإِن تَوَلَّيْتُمْ فَاعْلَمُوا أَنَّمَا عَلَى رَسُولِنَا الْبَلَاغُ الْمُبِينُ. And if you turn your back, then our Prophet has nothing more to in his responsibility than to give you the clear warning and give you the admonition. It's up to you to implement, and your free will is to be exercised. Hopefully you will. Now, the outcome of that was that since the minds and the hearts were prepared, the outcome was that those who had it in their hand and they heard this, this injunction, they threw it. Who had it in their mouth, in fact, they spit it. Not because there was a policeman standing over their head with a gun, but because they knew that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was observing their actions and their life was dedicated to His obedience. Those who had it in their houses, they threw it out. And we said it was in almost every house. So they say that the streets of Medina were flowing like rivers of wine, simply because the people are hastily implementing this injunction. It's even mentioned that a caravan of wine was coming from Syria, and when the fellow came to find out that it was prohibited, he took his dagger and stabbed all of those, containers, and the entirety of his capital and his were-to-be prophet all sinks into the desert sand. Compare that with the prohibition, the very same legislation back in the Roaring '20s in this very country. It was a total disaster. And that gave birth to the notorious mafia. That's how the mafia started, by producing and selling illicit alcohol. Why? Because people are not prepared to leave it. And when you give an order that people are not prepared to desist from, they're going to find illicit ways. They're going to find ways to circumvent. So rather than trying to find ways to apply the law, people will use their intelligence to see how they can circumvent it. You see, a similar circumstance we have with zakat as opposed to income tax, which we mentioned earlier. So it was a total success. This legislature was a total success in Medina, and to a large extent, it remained successful, with Muslims throughout the world. And it was a total failure. The very same legislature, which was the right legislature, but wrongly presented and wrongly implemented. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give us all tawfiq to realize that these injunctions and the orders of Allah are for our benefit, and give us the ability to follow and therefore succeed in this life and in the next. Until our next episode, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.